Moscone's wife Gina and their 4 children struggled to grieve privately.
My mother was referred to as the widow Moscone, and wherever we went, people would acknowledge it. And so if we could never just have our private mourning process that families go through when they lose somebody.
But sadly, more than the Moscone family's grieving process would be interrupted. The months and years ahead would bring constant reminders of their loss and more unexpected news that would upset their future. Coming up, a shocking decision from the court that unleashes violence in the street.
People were horrified and appalled by all of it, and I wanted revenge.
And later, peace, love, and legal battles in the aftermath of Woodstock 1969.
You're watching What Happened After here on the History Channel.
Women over 50 are with them.
We want to sell you a car!
Now you can call anyone in America for 3 cents a minute, 39 cents to connect. Not only is it 3 cents anywhere in the U.S.
Channel.
Murders of San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and City Councilman Harvey Milk left the city's government in turmoil.
The board will continue.
Supervisor Diane Feinstein became acting mayor, and she appointed Harry Britt to fill Harvey Milk's seat. 5 months later, the tremors from the crime could still be felt throughout the community when on April 23, 1979, accused murderer Dan White went on trial.
We knew that this case would be scrutinized. We wanted every T crossed, every I dotted. Tom Norman, the prosecutor, had the epitome of a homicide case. He had the murder weapon. He had a confession to 2 believable first-degree murder cases.
It looked like an open and shut case. But sitting with Dan White at the defendant's table was a resourceful 32-year-old defense attorney, Douglas Schmidt.
At first blush, it was daunting, but it was clear to me that it had to have something to do with mental states. You know, a guy with his background didn't have any criminal record, ex-policeman, ex-fireman, ex-supervisor at that point, wouldn't do this unless he had a rubber band snap.
Schmidt argued that White's was a case of diminished capacity. Martin Blinder, one of the psychiatrists who testified for White, claimed that a terrible diet, including too much junk food, was partly to blame for White's depression. This defense would be derided as the Twinkie defense.
I think the point he was trying to make primarily was that it was an indication of underlying depression, but it was one of those handy tags that we in the media catch on to, the Twinkie defense, and it stuck.
The jury deliberated for 6 days. Dan White looked on stoically as the verdict was read. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter. White had beaten the charges of premeditated murder and escaped the death penalty. Diminished capacity or Twinkie defense, Doug Schmidt had won. White was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison. He would be eligible for parole in just 5. As word of the stunning verdict spread, angry crowds began to gather in the Castro district.
I wanted revenge. Quite simply, I wanted revenge. People were pissed off, and it wasn't just gay people. People were horrified and appalled by all of it, but particularly there was anger. You shoot this guy, and you tell me that somebody ate Twinkies, and that's justified. Enough is enough.
Oh my God, they were storming City Hall, and police cars were in flames, and it was just a bigger reaction than I'd ever dreamed would occur, and it unsettled me.
Outraged at a verdict they believed was far too lenient, mobs torched at least a dozen police cars, assaulted more than 60 police officers, and injured just as many civilians. One report estimated the damage costs at $1 million.
Well, I'm certainly glad that it's all over, and I'd like to see it just kind of calm down and trail behind it. There were people that were virtually hostile from the start toward me. How could I defend such a monster? You would think that a case of this magnitude that had national exposure would catapult you into a higher stratus in terms of your business. Well, quite the opposite occurred. I was kind of too hot to handle, if you will, and I actually gave up the law practice for a couple of years, I think, sometime after this case.
Doug Schmidt moved to Reno and practiced real estate law, but his defense of Dan White was still the subject of public scrutiny. In 1981, the California legislature removed the diminished capacity defense as a means of reducing charges of criminal homicide.
It didn't call for the reaction that occurred with the legislature. They completely took out the diminished capacity in a number of very valid defenses. I regretted that.
Following the Dan White case, Frank Falzon became San Francisco's star homicide detective. His biggest moment came in 1985, when he and his partner uncovered information that led to the arrest of California's most notorious serial killer, Ricardo Ramirez. Falzon lost contact with his former colleague Dan White while White served jail time. But Falzon couldn't miss the headlines in January 1984, when another bombshell was dropped on the case. Dan White was let out of prison. And before Falzon knew it, he would come face to face with his old friend once again. Coming up, Dan White makes another fatal decision. Startling revelations from one victim's son. Plus, life goes on for a city rocked to its core.
You're watching What Happened After here on the History Channel.